This is the What's Next Teacher Podcast with your host, Dr. Julie Warner.
Here you'll hear from former teachers who have left the classroom for thriving careers in and outside of education to help you picture yourself on the other side and land the job of your dreams.
If you're feeling confused about what to do next, stuck, or fearful about paying the bills, What's Next Teacher has your back.
Now here's your host, Dr. Julie Warner.
Hey guys, thanks for tuning in. This week I bring you part 2 on boundaries as promised. We've got Dr. Sharon Martin on the pod, and she offered a lot of concrete tips, actionable steps that you can put in place if you are feeling emotionally drained at work, if you're feeling overworked, if you're feeling manipulated, guilted, all of the things that we face as teachers that challenge our boundaries. She addresses them in this episode. Thanks to those of you that sent in listener questions. I was able to address all of those with Dr. Martin. So without further ado, let's start the show. All right, I'd like to welcome Dr. Sharon Martin, licensed psychotherapist, licensed clinical social worker, and Dr. Martin's been practicing for over 2 decades and specializes in helping people with issues around perfectionism and codependency. And teachers, listen up, people pleasing and self-compassion. That's something that we really need to hone in on. And so I'm really pleased that she's on the podcast today to talk to us about a topic that I think is sort of everything is a tributary that comes back to boundaries. It feels like when teachers are coming to me with questions and issues about how to manage problems they're having in the workplace. So we'll just get started with some of the listener questions. And by the end of this, you're going to have airtight boundaries. I just know it.
Well, that might be selling it a little bit much, Julie, but we'll hope it to help, though.
Well, let's just start by talking about how you define boundaries. This is such a slippery concept for teachers, but people in general.
Yeah, I think for our purposes today, we can keep it pretty simple and really think about a boundary as a limit that we're going to set. I like to use the idea of a gate and thinking about you can open and close that gate and let in or keep out certain people or situations, things that are supportive of you and your goals and your health, healthy relationships. But we can't just leave that gate wide open all the time, right? Because then everything can come in and there's no discernment about what do we want in our lives? How do we want to spend our time? How do we want to use our resources? Again, what's healthy and helpful for us? So we need to have that boundary there, that limit that we can set that says yes or no, depending on the circumstances.
Yes. And so these boundaries, when we're talking about boundaries for teachers, do you differentiate between boundaries around things like your time and kind of boundaries around your physical presence versus emotional boundaries?
Yeah, we can think about different categories of boundaries. So I think if that's helpful for people, they can do that. Again, sort of the function and the way we go about it is basically the same no matter what kind of boundary we're talking about. But again, we can just think about, right, our time, our money, our emotions, our physical safety. Those are all certainly areas that we would need to have boundaries in. And again, those specific boundaries will be different in different situations. But again, I think if that helps people to think about, okay, I gotta, be sort of attending to boundaries in a variety of different areas of my life, then we can do that.
Right. Yeah. The teachers I work with want to leave teaching and find new careers in different industries. And typically they're citing as one of the key reasons is that they're drowning because of all the different demands on the job. And when I ask them what's holding them back from leaving, the number one thing I hear is guilt. And for me, that demonstrates the lack of emotional boundaries. And I wonder what you would say about that.
Yeah, I think again, they all sort of come together, because if we look underneath that feeling of guilt, that, sense that, it would be wrong, or I'd be letting somebody down, perhaps, if they were to leave and to not do all the extra work that they're doing. So underneath that guilt, there's probably weak boundaries in a variety of different areas. So again, we can think about, it's probably time, it's probably money, it's probably emotions. All of those different areas are probably leading to that sense of being burnt out and not, feeling like they're able to leave and, feel good about that, or feel like that's a valid choice for them to be able to do that, to take care of themselves in that situation.
Yep. And do you think that folks like teachers or others in the helping professions are more prone to having issues in this area?
Oh, for sure. If we think about, I was telling you before we started recording, teachers or social workers or nurses, people who are drawn to those professions, I think, are people who, genuinely have a big heart, that they go into it because they care about other people. They want to be helpful. They want to be of service to folks. And so, then on the one hand, it's like it's easy for them to be taken advantage of, I think, by, systems and institutions that want to, use their labor and sort of manipulate their good intentions and their compassion for other people, unfortunately. So yes, those of us that are helpers by natures, or empaths, or sensitive people pleasers, whatever category you fall into there, some combination of all of those. Right, it makes sense that we're going to have a harder time, saying no to other people when they ask something of us, because we want so much to help other people, to please other people, to do the right thing, to be a good person, essentially. And so I think, learning how to set boundaries, we've also got to change some of that thinking, that sense that, right, because if we're holding this idea that being self-sacrificing, being a martyr in some situations, is the definition of a good teacher, or a good person, a good woman, a good mother, whatever the case may be, right, then we're setting ourselves up for that really difficult time, being able to set some boundaries and say, hey, wait a minute, I have needs too, which of course is the reality, is that we all have needs that we need to take care of ourselves, especially if we're going to be able to take care of other people.
Yeah, I think that's a great point. And it makes me think too about identity and how one's identity really plays into this. I think a lot of teachers feel like if I institute boundaries, then I might not be a nice person anymore. And I want to be a kind person. I don't want to be depleted, but at the same time, I don't want to be, uncaring, and I don't want to change who I am fundamentally.
Yeah, I think that's something that we hear a lot, because again, we're sort of equating giving without any limits as the definition of being, good or virtuous, or, that compassionate person. And we need to shift some of that thinking to be able to include the idea that both that taking care of ourselves is our responsibility, and that's a self-compassionate thing to do, but also that setting limits with other people can also be like, we can do it with compassion, certainly, right? We don't have to be mean about setting the boundary, but also that setting that boundary can be good for other people, or, again, good for, the school system, even good for the kids, whether that's that we're modeling something healthy for them, so that they can learn how to set boundaries, and they can see how it's done, and they can, again, we also want to think about just like, how are we helping people if we give, and then are burned out, and then we get sick, or then we leave the profession, right? That's not actually helping the people that we set out to help, right? So if we actually want to be able to continue to do, acts of service, even if that's not as a teacher, right? I mean, I think, again, people who go into the teaching profession, probably even after they leave that profession, they still want to be involved in their communities and, take care of people and do things to help other people. But we need to be able to do that in a way that actually works for us, that we can maintain that long term, rather than it just being, sort of burning out so quickly. I know you can, relate to that idea of like, you spend a lot of time training to do something and then realize it's not sustainable. I'm sure that's difficult and discouraging, and that's not really what anybody is looking for.
That's right. And it's very disappointing to me now, looking back and knowing what I know, that we aren't taught about any of this in our teaching preparation programs. And then you get into the school environment and the ethos is it's for the kids. You're going to stay from 6:30 a.m. to 8 p.m. every day, and you're going to, take work home on the weekends, but it's for the kids. So how can you say no to that as a teacher? You can't, if you have no training or no real concept of that kind of, self-compassion, boundaries, and such. And something else that you were talking about boundaries supporting healthy relationships and as such being an act of caring. I think a lot about this, because when you don't say no and you want to say no, it's almost that you're trying to control the other person and how they perceive you, which isn't caring, right? And I wonder what you would say about that notion.
Yeah, I think you're right. I mean, if you're overly concerned about what other people think of you, you do end up in these situations where you're sort of living your life for other people, always trying to have them think about you, perceive you in a particular way, but ultimately you really don't have any control over that. And again, if you keep living your life, you're going to end up burned out and resentful. I think that's the other thing that comes up so often for people, is this feeling of resentment when you keep saying yes to things that you really don't want to do, or you don't have time for, whatever. They don't work for you. You don't even need to have a particular reason why. You can just say, this doesn't work for me. Right, but it's that recipe for resentment to start brewing, and over time that can really undermine, I think, our efforts to be that compassionate person that we want to be, because it's hard to show up every day and give when really you're feeling like, nobody cares about me. What about me? When do I get a chance? I have, no time for myself or for my family, or I have no money in my bank account. All of those things that, again, are not sustainable for people, professionally or personally.
Yep. 100%. Well, I want to get to a question from a listener, and this person was talking about that teachers see so much terrible stuff on the job, kids who are being abused or neglected at home, kids who are hungry, there's poverty, there are students that have serious trauma that's untreated. And then with the pandemic, we really saw that exacerbated inequities even further. And it's really, really hard for teachers to see that. And, we go into this profession, the helping profession, because we're caring, we want to make a difference. But that ends up being a really heavy weight to carry. And so this teacher is asking, how can you, in the face of all of that, put the right emotional boundaries in place?
Such a hard question. I mean, because you're right. I mean, it is such a heavy load to bear, first of all. And again, I think it just speaks so much to the need for self-care. And again, we can't have self-care if we don't have boundaries. I would say probably, boundaries are an essential piece of both having the time and energy and money for self-care, but they are actually a form of self-care, right? There's something that we do to take care of ourselves, is to put those limits there. but again, I mean, it's such a tough situation. I know I don't need to, tell you or any of your listeners, because I'm sure everybody out there, feels that pull on their heart and knows that, it does weigh heavy on your mind and your heart and your body. So, I mean, again, I think if we want to think about this almost like for the long term, instead of the short term, and thinking about if you have a child in front of you having a crisis, of course, our immediate sense of responsibility, or again our compassion, is like, okay, I need to do everything I can for this child right here at this moment. And I'm not saying, obviously do attend to the child's immediate needs, but recognize that you as the teacher cannot be that child's parent or therapist or social worker or everything else that they need in their life. You can't possibly do all of that. I mean, first of all, your role is not set up for that. But you also have a lot of other demands on your time and energy that make it impractical. So I think this is a place where you almost want to think about having a little bit of detachment. And I know that can sound harsh, but again, it's really a concept that can help us help people over the long term. It's sort of related to that idea of, how do you not take it home with you, right? How do I kind of keep some limits around it? And it is something you have to practice. I think it does get easier for most people over time, but you have to be very intentional about it. Some people even have some specific rituals that help them make that transition from work to home. It really helps them mark, this is the end of my workday. This is the end of my time of, thinking about or worrying about or, strategizing how to help these students. And then I'm going to, have a separate time. This is my home time. This is my family time. This is my personal time. So there's that clear, demarcation for you, at least, in your mind, so that when you're physically leaving that. And I know it's not always that simple, because probably in reality you're taking work home with you, but you might again sort of think about being intentional about what work you're taking home, where you're doing it, and when you're doing it at home, so that it doesn't just feel like work sort of permeates every space in your home as well, and that you're doing it all the time in every place, but maybe there's a particular place at home where you do school work, and maybe you limit it to grading papers or lesson planning, versus thinking about, how am I going to help Susie get a new pair of pants because she has nothing to wear, like maybe that sort of emotional labor, or how am I going to find a tutor for Johnny, or whatever, like sort of that emotional piece, maybe that's done at school. And I think it's also a great reminder of the importance of getting support, and talking to other teachers, talking to people who understand, and also, really, I think seeking out other teachers or support people who also are supportive of setting boundaries. Because again, I mean, again, it's helpful to vent to a degree, but if we're all just saying, here's the same problems, and then we don't do anything to change the fact that, we're being asked to do so many things, and we're saying yes to all of those asks, right? It's more helpful if we can cultivate some relationships with other people who are interested in putting the action into it and saying, okay, and this isn't working. Like, what can we actually do to change some of this, individually or collectively? So sort of that like minds to support the idea that boundaries are good, and this is not a bad thing for us to be doing at work.
Yeah, I think that's so beautiful, especially because it really makes the concept concrete, to think about it as grounding your boundaries in particular places, and having that kind of trigger in your mind and saying, well, I'm at home now, so we're not going to go there emotionally at this time. Yeah, I love that.
Yeah, and again, I know it's in the reality, it's not always that simple. And so I would also encourage people that, if you're trying to do that, but then you find yourself thinking and worrying about Johnny at home, just try to contain it. You can say something like, okay, I'm going to give myself 10 minutes to think about this or worry about it or deal with this, and then I'm going to put it away again until tomorrow when I'm at the classroom. Again, to try to put that kind of emotional boundary around it. And again, also just, I think it helps to recognize how emotionally draining it all is, rather than trying to say, this is what I signed up for, or this is what all teachers are going through. We don't want to minimize it and, make it seem like it's not a big deal when it is. Because again, that doesn't help any of us to try to make it smaller than it is. It is a lot to bear.
Yeah, it really is. And it's really even more to bear when you are in that environment where everyone else, there's that social pressure to overgive and to have weak boundaries. So I think, yeah, that's exactly right. I like what you said too about finding like-minded individuals, because that does help to counter that socialization of that overgiving that we encounter in school. And it makes me think too about how beautiful it would be if we were the first ones. We were the first models for setting boundaries, and that will help to create that change.
Finding your next job after teaching can feel impossible, mostly because translating your teacher resume for different industries can be really tough. That's why What's Next Teacher created resume templates for all the most common jobs teachers are applying for as they embark on what's next. But these aren't blank templates. They come pre-populated with teacher skill-based resume bullets with the skills employers are looking for each type of position. They reflect all the kinds of skills and experience teachers have, but without education jargon and with industry keywords. They're instantly downloadable and fully editable, and they use the skills-based or functional resume format, which is the most optimal format for teacher job changers because it puts the focus squarely on your skills and experience, rather than where you work and when, so you aren't pigeonholed on the job market. Plus, they allow you to easily optimize your resume for applicant tracking systems, or ATS, those pesky machine screeners. Don't pay for an expensive resume writer who will create one generic resume that isn't tailored for the specific job roles you're applying for. With the What's Next Teacher resume templates, you'll have a formatted, pre-populated resume ready to go that draws on teaching skills so you can see exactly how to represent your teaching skills for a vast array of different positions.
Yeah, because we can't just wait around for somebody else to do it. And I think just using the word boundaries can actually be really helpful. I think it's a concept that, more people are understanding. I'm not sure how much education kids are getting around it, but I think certainly high schoolers, are familiar with the idea. So I think it could actually work quite well. Probably even with younger kids, they'll catch on to the idea of it. When you need to say, no, I can't do that, or that's not something I'm going to do, is to say I'm setting a boundary around that. That doesn't work for me. And again, I think it's just a very simple way to model it for the kids, so that they start to say, oh, it's okay, for people to do that. And it's called a boundary. And this is what it looks like when somebody sets one. Because I think that's also why it's so hard, is that nobody teaches you how to set boundaries. I don't know about you, but when I grew up, nobody talked about boundaries. Nobody explained what they were or why we needed them. They certainly didn't use the word boundary. There might have been some, some of the concepts there, certainly, but I think that can help almost maybe the teacher spirit in people is to think, well, I'm not just doing it for me. I'm setting the boundary, to teach other people. That's your job, is to teach other people. Right? I'm going to teach kids about boundaries by showing them how I set boundaries and saying, I can't stay after school today. I have something else I need to do, or I just can't. Again, you don't always have to give an explanation. It's perfectly valid to say, I just can't do that. And then you say, I can do it another day. My office hours are, Monday, Wednesday, Friday. So today's Thursday, so unfortunately I can't do that.
Yeah.
And
Yeah.
people start to learn what you're willing to do and what you're not willing to do when you stick to it. I mean, I think that's the other thing, is sometimes we undermine our own efforts to set boundaries by setting them and then not sticking to them. So that might be another thing that can be useful for people to just kind of reflect on. Especially, think back, like, what did I set up at the beginning of the year? Because you probably set some boundaries, and am I actually, actually following through on them? Or have I now, halfway through the year, let it all slide and I'm just, doing whatever?
Yeah, 100%. Yeah, for me, in looking back on it, I'm the oldest of 4 kids, and my parents both work full time. So I was a parentified child, and I was told explicitly to keep my siblings in line. And if they were doing something unfortunate during the day, and I was punished for that. And so that made me, that gave me the message that I was responsible for how other people acted, and I was responsible for other people's choices and responsible for my parents' emotions, right? Because I am doing all of this stuff for my parents to help them out and make them feel okay. So yeah, I think how do you begin, if let's say that you don't have a therapist or access to therapy, how do you begin to really unpack sort of your positionality as an individual and figure out, well, where do I even fall on this whole spectrum of boundaries?
Well, not to be too self-promotional here, Julie, but I have a lot of resources on my website about boundaries. I have a quiz that people can take on there that's free, and lots of free articles and a newsletter. And then I've written a workbook that's called the Better Boundaries Workbook that, can help people with a deeper dive, people who really want to explore the issues of their own boundaries and how do I go about setting them in, all areas of my life. So those are some of the resources that I've created that, are sort of a self-help kind of nature. And again, there's lots of information, I think, out there about boundaries nowadays. So that is really good that we have access to information now that we didn't always have. So I think just looking around, people will find more information. But one of the things I also encourage people to do is to just start paying attention to how your friends and families and coworkers set boundaries, and see if you can find some people that are essentially some role models for you. You don't even have to tell people that you're doing this, but sometimes it's helpful to notice people who are not setting boundaries and what that looks like. But it's probably more helpful to think about, okay, who do I notice setting some boundaries? How are they doing that? How is it working for them? How might I take that and change it and make it my own? You can also look for examples on TV or in books that you read, and all kinds of places. They don't actually have to be real people that you know. But again, this just sort of helps with the idea, like, I'm not really sure how to do it. I don't know what it really looks like or sounds like when people do that. So if we can actually see it in action with other people doing it, then it starts to, I think, just come a little bit more naturally to us, that we, again, you'll sort of find your own style and how you approach things. And I think about it like any other skill. It's going to be clunky and uncomfortable at first, but you will get better at it the more that you practice it. And it's also, I think, just as much about what you're doing on your side, but also recognizing that if you're a person who has not been setting boundaries for a long time, that other people have come to expect that from you. And so if you start to set boundaries, they are probably going to push back. They are going to question you. And that doesn't necessarily mean that they will not respect your boundaries. Often it just means that people need time to adjust. And again, depending on the circumstance, depending on the person, you may or may not even tell that person, hey, I'm trying to learn how to set better boundaries. So, if it's a close family member, a spouse, or, a parent, you might say something like that. It's at work. may or may not be appropriate to do that. But in any case, realize that it's a process for everybody involved. So, there's going to be this sort of back and forth until we kind of find our groove of, I feel comfortable saying no, and the other person starts to understand that that's going to happen sometimes, and they're going to work on accepting that and realize that you can't be the person who says yes every time. Right. Because that's hard for them on their end too. If they're always like, I can go to Julie and she's going to say yes to everything. And now I go to Julie. Sometimes Julie says no. I might feel disappointed or upset about that. But hopefully I can get on board with it and go, okay, you know what? That's okay. Julie needs to say no sometimes. And I can ask Mary, and I can ask, Sally and, Mike and, other people and figure it out.
Yeah. And I've heard about that concept of the extinction burst, when you start to change the way that you're relating to other people and they push back. And that is really hard when you are in that nascent space of just starting to set boundaries. But I did hear something along the lines of, that is like the best practice opportunity that you can get, because when people are pushing back, and like you're saying, that's their emotional load to deal with. So, that's a great way to practice boundaries and say to yourself, like, I don't need to care for that person's emotions right now about how they feel about me saying no.
Yeah, I think if you can go into it expecting some pushback, it makes it easier. So it doesn't catch you by surprise that, people, are having a negative response to this. So expect some of that because it's normal. And like I said, it doesn't mean that they won't come around. I would say the majority of people do. Yeah. We just need to let them practice and, get used to sort of this new, boundaried version of me. Because it affects them as well.
Yeah, definitely. I have another listener question, and this listener wondered, she had left her teaching position and then found out through the grapevine, and folks were reaching out to her that were her former coworkers and saying, well, people are gossiping about you and how you left, and they're talking crap about you. And she was really distressed about this. And I wonder how you think about navigating something like that, because it's a real concern for so many teachers.
Oh, again, it's such a tough one because, I feel for that. And, I think we want to remember we need to acknowledge that that's painful. To hear that's happening, that hurts. And so, again, we don't want to just be like, oh, well, get over it. There's nothing you can do about it. So tend to your feelings. Again, that's an important piece of self-care in this situation, is to, notice how that feels and give yourself some love and some care around that. There is, however, a certain truth to the fact, as you were, noting earlier, that we can't control what other people think or say or do. And so that certainly, I'm reminded of that in this situation, is that if they're going to be gossiping about you, what are you going to do about it? I mean, on some level, there's not a lot that you can do.
Yeah.
Right. And the alternative is to live your life in a way that you think nobody will gossip about you. Right? There's no guarantee that they won't, but the alternative here is to do what you think that they think you should do. And that's not a fulfilling way to live your life, right? You need to live your life for you and do what is right for you. And then we need to deal with, the outcome of that. And sometimes that's people are going to be unhappy with the decisions that you make, jealous maybe, there's all kinds of reasons for the gossip. I don't know what it is. And, it probably doesn't matter really, because there's not a whole lot that you can do about it. But, for me, I think it's helpful to just kind of recognize the flip side of that situation, which was, well, would you have rather stayed because that's what they think you should do? Should you just, stay at a job because other people think you should work there?
Yeah.
It doesn't really make any sense, right? So, and again, I don't want to minimize the hurt that can, there really is hurt from the gossip, but I do think it's also probably a situation that it will pass. They're not going to be gossiping about you a year from now. I doubt. It's probably short-lived. People have feelings about it right now, but they will move on, and so will you.
Yeah, I think that's exactly right. And I've heard too, like a logical way to approach it is to think about, you come in contact with hundreds of people in your everyday life that are in your circles, that are in your milieu. And are you going to be able to please 100 people? No. And so, you've got to at least be able to please one, and that's going to have to be you, right?
That's you. Yes, I agree with that completely. You really need to think about whose opinion really matters in this situation. And the first person whose opinion matters is yours. And then it's the people closest to you. And probably your coworkers are, a ways down the list here. Hopefully their opinions don't matter too much. And that, again, it does help us just put it in perspective that it sucks that, they're doing that, but their opinion is not the most important thing to me.
Yeah. Do you have advice for teachers who do leave the job and then start a job somewhere else? I look at this like an opportunity to sort of start afresh. And
right. I mean, I think there's truth in that, of course, but you still have to have the skills to put into place, right? So if you have no idea how to set a boundary, it's still going to be hard no matter where you go. I mean, it may not be as exploitative of a situation as what you were coming from, but you probably do still need to, do some practice, do some work on it. But I usually say to people that it's easier to start a new relationship, a new workplace situation, having firmer boundaries and then lightening them up if you don't need them to be so firm, versus it's much harder to start with the weak boundaries and then tighten them up, because that's exactly what we were talking about earlier. People get used to you having the weak boundaries and then they get used to taking advantage of them. So I would say sort of go in probably with what you think is probably overly, firm boundaries. Because I also think it's possible that folks who aren't really used to setting boundaries, what might feel really firm to you might actually be kind of average.
Right.
But again, I would err on the side of being a little bit more firm with the boundaries, again, with the idea that you can lighten them up. If nobody's testing your boundaries, if nobody's taking advantage of you, and it's really not an issue, you may not need to have, specific days that are office hours or, I don't know, the equivalent of that at your new job. So,
yeah, that's so important. And it's an interesting thing to think about too, because where do teachers or anyone, where do they go to really figure out where the boundaries should fall? When I was looking back at this, I realized, my advice for teachers would be, first of all, look at your contract. What are you legally obligated to do? And I realized I didn't even read those contracts. I signed them year after year. And then I just did whatever anyone asked of me. And then I tried to save every kid that was hungry or needed something. And, it spirals out of control. Are there other ways to sort of, find that starting point to do that level setting?
I'm not sure. I mean, I do agree with you that I think starting with the contract is absolutely important, that you need to know what you are legally required to do, what you have signed up to do, right? And then think about everything else is extra.
Yeah.
One way I kind of think about this also is, and I don't know, in my head, I make this like a pie chart. I don't know if it's necessary, but, I sort of think about, there's this fixed amount of time and money and resources, emotional energy, all that stuff. It's like there's a fixed amount of it. And I can divide that up into whatever, slices I want. But I can't easily make more. And so I need to think about, where do I want to spend my money? Where do I want to spend my time? Where do I want to, spend my emotional
Like a budget.
Yes, exactly. Because I can't just have limitless amounts. And so if I spend it all at work, I'm going to have nothing, for my personal relationships, or nothing for my physical health, or, whatever my other needs are. So I don't know, maybe that's helpful for people, just to remember that there's a limited amount of you basically to go around,
Yeah.
and be thoughtful about where you're going to spend all of that.
Yeah. Yeah. I think that's such a nice, concrete way to think about it. This is why I love your work. Are there other, things that you would say to teachers that I haven't asked about?
Mhm. Oh, I think it's just sort of a generic, it really is okay to set some boundaries. It's hard, and I think, as you have really well articulated, that when you're working in an environment that expects you to have no boundaries, you're going to be like the fish, swimming against the current. But that doesn't mean it's not worth doing.
Yeah. I mean, that could feel wrong.
It does feel wrong. And maybe one other thing I might add here is try to remember that boundaries are not like an all or nothing. So it's not like I have boundaries or I don't have boundaries.
Yeah.
It's very much a work in progress. So you might think about, what are some small boundaries that I might be able to put into place? I don't need to think about changing everything and getting off of every committee and every after school activity and, figuring out everything that's going wrong. But you might say, okay, well, what's one small change that I can make that would help me reclaim some time, some money, some emotional energy? Again, whatever it is, let's make, okay, well, maybe I'm going to actually eat my lunch in the teacher's lounge instead of my classroom, so kids can't come and interrupt me. Like, maybe that's doable.
Yeah.
And I'm going to put a sign on my door and I'm going to do it.
Yeah. Yeah.
Again, whatever it is, that's just an example. I'm not a teacher, so I don't know really what teachers need to do, but, start small and then work your way up, because that might be something that I'm just using as an example to say, well, that might feel like, okay, I don't feel too bad about doing that. It'd be much harder for me to say to the principal, I can't do X, Y, and Z that I signed up for last week. That would feel really hard for me to do. So don't start with that. Start with something that's manageable. And then, right, think about, this is, I'm going to build on this, and I'm going to, slowly get to the place where I've got more boundaries in a lot of different areas.
Yeah, yeah, I love that, because I know I had to learn how to sit with those feelings of discomfort, and it's really hard if you're doing it all at once. So I like that. You start to build sort of a muscle and tolerance for that.
Yeah, it's a great way to put it.
Well, can you tell us about what you have going on right now and any other resources that you'd want to share with teachers?
Well, I hope people will go ahead and visit my website, which is livewellwithsharonmartin.com. And like I said, you can sign up for the newsletter there and take the boundaries quiz. And I think on the front page, there's a whole section of boundary related articles as well that people can check out. So that's a great place to start, I think, for folks. So thank you.
Yeah, and we'll put all of that into the show notes just to make it easier for everyone. Well, thank you so much, Dr. Martin. This has been just fantastic, and I know will be really informative for everybody looking to try to set boundaries in the midst of maybe what feels like an untenable, hopefully last school year, if they're wanting to leave. Or maybe you will decide you don't want to leave once you change yourself and change how you're showing up, and it becomes a different situation.
Yep. Well, thank you so much. It was a pleasure to be here. And I think it's a really important thing for us to talk about, not just boundaries, but boundaries for teachers, for sure.
Thank you. Hey guys, just a quick note to tell you about something new over at whatsnextteacher.com. It's a quiz. It's a quiz to help you determine whether or not it's really time for you to leave the classroom.
Being a teacher can be incredibly rewarding. There's no question about that, but it can also be incredibly challenging. Just ask anyone that's teaching right now. One of the top questions that I get from listeners is whether or not they should leave the classroom. Many are afraid of making a mistake and regretting leaving this career they once loved so much, and they also worry about losing their teaching license, which can be a significant barrier to re-entering the profession. I get it. I still keep my teaching certification current, even though I know I'll never go back to teaching. It's just a mental thing. But that's why we created a quiz that can help you determine whether or not it's time to leave teaching. This quiz is designed to help you evaluate your current situation and your feelings and determine if it's time to move on. By answering a series of questions, you'll be able to gain the insight you need to determine whether or not it's time to make a change. Go to whatsnextteacher.com/quiz to take the 2-minute quiz, and then shoot me a note and let me know if your results resonated.
Thanks for listening. If you enjoyed this episode and you'd like to help support the podcast, please share it with others, post about it on social media, or leave a rating and review.
To catch all the latest from Julie, check out whatsnextteacher.com or follow up on social media at What's Next Teacher across all platforms.
Thanks again, and see you next time.